Okay, I think we're going to get started. My name is, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining today. I think we have a lot of repeat registrants. So this is the second webinar in a three-part series in our Cooperative Directors 101 training series. This is typically a training that we do in person in one day, but obviously we have shifted that format because of coronavirus. We have registrants, I think, actually from more than one country and all over the US. So that's very exciting because we usually host this in Wisconsin. We don't usually get quite as big a draw. My name is Kelly Maynard. I'm the Cooperative Development Specialist at the Center for Cooperatives. And today we're going to have a different presenter. First, I'll go through some housekeeping items. So like last week, the webinar will run for an hour. All of your participant phone lines are muted. There'll be a presentation, and that will be followed by a live answer session. During the presentation, you can submit questions in the question box, which you can find on the right side of your screen. It's by the chat box or part of the chat box. We've also compiled the questions that you submitted with registration so that we can address some of those. The webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our website within a few days after today. So allow me to introduce the presenter. Today, our Executive Director at the Center for Co-ops, Courtney Berner, will be presenting on tools for an effective board. Courtney has been with the Center since 2011. She started as a co-op development specialist and then assumed the director role in January of 2018. She's done a tremendous amount of work in that almost decade now, doing co-op-related education, research, training in Wisconsin, and her work has been with folks all over the country, even while based in Wisconsin. So, Courtney, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Kelly. And when you say it, the word decade, that you might have, if you guys could see my face, it's like, oh, wow, a decade. It has been a long time. So I'm really happy to be here. I definitely prefer doing these kinds of trainings in person. I think governance in particular is a topic that lends itself to in-person dialogue and conversation. But it really still is a pleasure to be speaking with you here today. And like Kelly said, there are people joining from all over, which is really fun for me. I hail from the Pacific Northwest, and I saw someone from Oregon and someone from Washington State. So fun to be reaching different audiences with this content. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to cover 5 main topics today. And those 5 topics are core board documents, meeting strategies and practices, meeting roles, committees, and ground rules. So there are a lot of different things we could talk about related to improving board effectiveness, but these are the ones that we've decided to cover today. Again, I'll just remind you, this is part of a Directors 101 training, so we are, doing a high-level treatment of some of these topics, and are always welcome. You're always welcome to contact us with questions and to have deeper conversations. So let's start with core board documents. Whether you're a seasoned director or were just elected to your first cooperative board, it is important to understand the set of documents that shape the structure of your cooperative, explain how authority is distributed, and document key policies, procedures, and decisions. All of the documents I'm going to discuss today should align with the cooperative statutes in your state. And cooperative incorporation statutes can vary quite significantly by state. In Wisconsin, we have 2 cooperative statutes, Chapter 185 and Chapter 193. If you're not familiar with the cooperative statutes in your state, I suggest taking a look at our National Cooperative Resource Ecosystem Map, We just released it a few weeks ago, and you can easily find it on the UW Center for Cooperatives website. The map includes pretty comprehensive information on the cooperative statutes in each state, so it's a great resource. So let's start at the top of this sort of upside down pyramid with Articles of Incorporation. The Articles of Incorporation define core attributes of a cooperative, such as its name, period of existence. The articles may also include details related to cooperative stock and the number of membership classes and directors on the board. Articles are filed with the state when a new cooperative is established. And in Wisconsin, any amendments to the articles must be approved by the members and filed with the state. I believe this is true under most cooperative state statutes. So it's a little cumbersome to change the articles, so they really only deal with a couple of sort of top line issues related to the co-op structure. Next on the list is bylaws. Bylaws further define a cooperative's governance structure and the rights of members. Bylaws generally include provisions related to member eligibility, the size and structure of the board of directors, rules related to both board meetings and member meetings, and the allocation of net income, among other things. While changes to the Articles of Incorporation must be approved by members, cooperatives differ in terms of who has authority to change the bylaws. In some cooperatives, member approval is required. In others, the board of directors has the authority to change the bylaws without a vote of their membership. Regardless of how your cooperative is set up, in terms of who has this authority, it is good practice to review your cooperative's bylaws every few years to ensure they are still relevant and appropriate to your business. Bylaws are considered a legal document, however, they do not need to be filed with the state. Next is policies. A policy is a set of ideas or plans that is used as a guide for making decisions. So policies guide day-to-day actions and strategies while still allowing for flexibility. The key word for policies is guiding. In a cooperative, there are generally 3 types of policies that we think about. So there are board policies, there are board management policies, and there are operational policies. And while there may be outliers, certainly, most policies within a cooperative fall into one of these 3 buckets. Board policies tend to supplement the bylaws and provide more specific guidance on board practices and decision-making. They are written, approved, and amended by the board. A board might have policies related to meeting attendance, board compensation, or officer elections. Those are just some examples. The board also creates a second type of policy that I refer to here as board management policies. These policies provide guidance to management and may establish performance expectations and limitations on authority for that manager. An example of a board management policy might be a policy that requires the general manager to have a written succession plan in the case that something happens to them. Another common policy of this type is a limit on what the general manager can spend without board approval. Lastly, operational policies guide staff in the operation of the cooperative. These policies are typically established by managers within the cooperative, though in worker and housing cooperatives, these types of policies may be established by the board with input from employees or residents, depending on the type of cooperative. So next is procedures. Policies typically exist to guide decision-making, but procedures have a narrower focus. They describe step by step what actions to take in specific instances. Procedures have a beginning and an end and should be strictly followed to achieve the desired outcome. An example of a procedure might be step-by-step instructions for how your cooperative carries out annual elections. Similar to policies, procedures will apply to different groups and processes within an organization. When it comes to creating, updating, and implementing your policies and procedures, there are some key differences. Policies tend to be broad and general and change infrequently, whereas procedures offer a detailed description of activities and are likely to continuously change and improve as needed. The line between policies and procedures can be fine, though. While the 2 sets of documents are distinct, I want to acknowledge the gray area here. Many policies are broad and general, but policies can also be detailed and specific. So I like to say that when crafting or reviewing policies, board members should just consider the importance of the issue at hand and how prescriptive they wish to be. Broad policies leave room for interpretation and require the use of judgment and initiative, whereas specific policies spell out the desired action in more concrete terms. So second to last, we have job descriptions and charters. We may not typically think of job descriptions and committee charters as core board documents. However, they do play an important role in defining the roles, responsibilities, and authority of management, the board, officers, and committees. I think it's important that well-written job descriptions exist for both the general manager or CEO and for board members. They really are a good accountability tool for everyone that's participating in decision-making for that cooperative. Committee charters outline the scope of work and authority for committees. I'll talk a bit more about charters later in the webinar during the section on committees. Lastly, I'd like to mention that we consider meeting agendas and minutes core board documents as well. While they're not, something you file with the state, they are can be legal documents as well. So most board activity takes place in board meetings. So meeting agendas and minutes serve as the official records of board business and should be drafted, created, maintained with care. Meeting minutes should not be a he said, she said, they said of the meeting. It's not a script. What they should include is the date, time, and location of the meeting, the names of the attendees, decisions that were made, and action items. I will dive more deeply into meeting agendas in the next section, so I'll save that. All right, well, thanks for sticking with me through that long list. I realize that talking about governance documents is maybe not the most compelling content, but I do think it's critical information because being an effective director requires that you understand and are able to navigate your cooperative's governance system. This list of core documents can serve as a bit of a roadmap if you are trying to find answers to questions you may have about the structure of your co-op or how decisions are made, especially if you're new. So if you are new to your board of directors and these documents haven't been shared with you, I suggest asking where you can find them. And if you don't have some of them, that's an opportunity to have a conversation about creating them. Now let's turn to the topic of meeting agendas. It's one of my favorites. I really like talking about agendas. I think they're important. But before we dive into the different components of a meeting agenda and how to craft one, I want to address why we set them in the first place. I might be biased, but I think meeting agendas are one of the most important ingredients for an effective meeting. Well-crafted agendas help structure and prioritize how time is spent during a meeting. They keep people focused on the highest priority topics, in theory. They also inform board members' expectations about a meeting and help them show up better prepared to successfully participate. So now that we've covered the why of agendas, let's talk about the how. A mediocre agenda is certainly better than no agenda, but putting some time and consideration into agenda setting will pay dividends when you're in the meeting room, or these days, perhaps on a video call, not in a physical room together. It might be even more important in that case. So how agendas are set depends on the cooperative or who sets the agenda. The most common method I hear is that the board president sets the meeting agenda in consultation with the general manager or the CEO. It can be a useful practice, I found, to involve the vice president or the vice chair in the agenda setting process too. That's how we did it when I was on the Willie Street board, and it was a really great way to broaden the number of people who sort of had buy-in into the agenda. And also, if the vice president ends up facilitating the board meeting for some reason, they have a better handle on the thought and strategy that went into crafting the agenda. I just want to say that it is not the job of the general manager or the CEO to set board agendas, even though that does happen in some cooperatives. One caveat that I'll mention, and that doesn't apply if you're part of a worker cooperative and the general manager or CEO is also the board chair, which is sometimes the case. So what should be included in an agenda? While a list of topics is certainly a good starting point, there's so much more that can be added. To each topic, I suggest adding the time allotted, the person responsible for the topic, the desired outcome, any necessary background information and materials that attendees should review ahead of time, and the process that will be used to achieve the outcome for each topic. I will cover outcomes and processes in greater detail in the next few slides. Determining the best order for the topics is more of an art than a science. I generally try to start meetings with a simple item or two and place any complicated or controversial topics toward the middle of the meeting. It is nice to have a couple of easy wins at the front end, and I like to avoid having or holding difficult conversations last when people are more likely to be tired and itching to leave the meeting. If you're a new director, I suggest asking who sets the agenda for your board meetings and how things get added to the agenda. I have found that it's sometimes one of those things that is not spelled out explicitly in policies and procedures, even though it's quite important. So it can be worth asking. In addition to the agenda, most co-ops circulate a board packet before the meeting. This packet should include minutes from the previous meeting, various reports from committees or the general manager, and any other additional information the board will need to fully participate in the meeting. Ideally, this board packet is circulated 5 to 7 days in advance of the meeting so that directors have adequate time to prepare. I know that that can be a hard deadline to meet, but I do think it's important if you want people to show up prepared for the meeting. Some boards still circulate hard copies, while many have gone totally electronic. There are a lot of factors that influence how a co-op decides to circulate board packets, including the preference and tech savviness of directors, internet accessibility, culture, cost, and I'm sure there are others. Now I would like to spend some time explaining an agenda setting framework that I found really helpful. I learned about it when I went through the Facilitating by Heart training that's offered each year through the UW Division of Continuing Studies. My colleague Kelly, who introduced me earlier, has been through that training, and one of our other colleagues has as well. And we've all found it to be a really helpful tool for our meetings. It's called a top-notch agenda. The T stands for topic, which is what you're meeting to discuss. The O stands for outcome, which is the desired results related to the topic. And the P stands for the process you use to engage all group members. The idea is that meetings are more focused and effective when every topic on the agenda is accompanied by an outcome and a process. So let's dive into how you use a top-notch agenda. Topics are pretty self-explanatory since they are what most of the agendas we see consist of. Outcomes can be a little trickier to set. There are 4 basic categories of outcomes. The first, share information, but no decision is going to be made. Second, generate and analyze information, but no decision will be made. Third, the group will make a decision. The fourth category, continuous improvement, refers to agenda items that are oriented toward improving the board or some other aspect of the organization. So as you'll see on the next slide, these aren't the actual words that I use for outcomes on agendas, but I try to always craft outcomes that fall into one of these categories so that it's clear to people that are participating what they will be expected to do for that agenda item. So establishing a desired outcome is helpful to both the facilitator and the meeting participants because a topic can have many different potential outcomes. For example, if you saw the topic hiring a new marketing manager on an agenda, what would you expect to discuss? How would you prepare for the meeting? Would you expect a simple verbal update, or would you expect to be asked to make a meaningful contribution to a discussion or decision? I suspect you have no idea. I realize I'm using a sort of extreme example here. The topic is pretty general, but it is not uncommon to see topics that are this broad on meeting agendas. You know, people are busy, and I find that you're more likely to get a high level of engagement if you direct people to the topics that matter most at a meeting. And one of the ways to do that is through adding an outcome to the topic. So doing this, adding outcomes to topics, also forces the agenda setter to be clear with themselves about what they are hoping to accomplish in the meeting related to that topic. Outcomes also help directors come to meetings better prepared, especially if they know they will be expected to make a decision at the meeting. Next, let's talk about meeting processes. In most meetings, open discussion tends to be the default. Open discussion isn't always bad, but there are so many other ways to engage members of your group in discussion and decision-making than just opening up the floor and asking who has an opinion. Just like with outcomes, processes are useful for both the facilitator and the participants. Sometimes even the process of adding an outcome or a process to an agenda makes me realize the topic doesn't need to be on the agenda at all. I have definitely had that happen when crafting our staff meeting agendas. You know, it could just be an update that I share via email or Slack or Teams or some other platform. You know, in other cases, it forces me to be really reflective about the best way to approach a brainstorming session or a group decision. So processes also help participants know what to expect. Are they just going to be listening to a presentation or an update, or do they really need to come with their thinking caps on, having already given some thought to a topic because they will be, you know, engaged in a group decision-making process that will result in a decision that day. So before moving on to meeting roles, which is our next topic, I'd like to go a little deeper on process and decision-making as a group. So when we talk about decision-making, we often lump several components of decision-making together. For example, a board might say they use consensus as their decision-making rule, or that everyone must agree on all decisions. The word consensus actually means to think and feel together. It is the process. Working toward consensus is the decision-making process. So there are many different process tools a group can use to think and feel together with the goal of making a decision. At some point, the group reaches closure in the decision-making process. Reaches closure is sometimes called the decision-making rule. The importance of the decision can impact both the process a group uses to work through the decision and the means of reaching closure. So we don't have time to explore the wide variety of processes you can try in your meetings, but I will share a couple of simple ones that our team often uses. And there are lots of resources that we would be happy to share with you where you can find more of these processes. So let's start with process. The first process I'd like to mention, I just call here reflect and share. The idea is that instead of posing a question or asking for feedback, then immediately launching into conversation, you take a moment of silence and let people collect their thoughts in writing or in their heads before anyone speaks. So all of us benefit from having a moment to pause, reflect, and write before responding to a question. Some of us really need it in order to make our highest contributions. So I found that adding a short time for quiet reflection and writing puts everyone in the group on a more even playing field and often leads to more equal participation in a group. Think, pair, share is a similar concept that tends to be appropriate for more complicated questions or discussions. Instead of moving straight from reflection to sharing with the full group, meeting participants pair off to discuss their initial thoughts before reporting back to the full group. Once you've taken that pause, sort of how do you open up the floor as a facilitator? I am definitely guilty of defaulting to just opening up the floor in a popcorn style. So whoever is fastest, whoever is quickest on their feet speaks first. They get the first word. it can be useful to really reflect on how always defaulting to that process within your group might be helping or hindering your group as a whole. You know, is there one person on your board who is quick on their feet and thus always gets to say the first piece, their piece first? You know, and how does that impact group dynamics and the flow of conversation? Whose voices are you not hearing because of that dynamic? I think it really can be true that people have different learning styles and different ways of engaging and different skills in terms of their verbal communication. And I think creating a more even playing field might invite participation that you didn't even realize you were missing out on as a group. So when asking for feedback or brainstorming, it can be useful to do a more structured go around instead of letting people chime in like kernels of popping corn. So maybe you go around the room, and maybe the next time you go around the room the other way. Like I said, some people are quick to respond verbally, which allows them to more frequently set the tone of further discussion, sort of with their initial response. You know, if you disagree with the person who almost always speaks first, it's creating this dynamic where in order to participate, it's sort of setting up that you have to engage in a disagreement with the person who shared their opinion first. So I find backing away from that popcorn style, especially for the decisions that maybe matter more or that might be a little more sensitive, can be a useful tool. Lastly, I want to mention the criteria matrix, which can be used when a group is trying to evaluate a single proposal or a few different options. So the first step is that the group comes up with a set of criteria or priorities by which they want to evaluate the proposal or set of proposals. The group then evaluates the proposal or proposals against the criteria in an attempt to gain clarity about the best path forward. This is another opportunity, you could do this and have it up on a whiteboard and do it all as one big group. But this tool also offers you the opportunity to have individuals maybe fill out their own matrices first, talk to a partner about their matrix, and then share with the larger group. So again, it's a tool that can work in a few different ways for inviting more thoughtful decision-making and greater participation within a group. So let's move on to closure tools. There are also different tools for reaching closure in the decision-making process. As I mentioned earlier, the importance of the decision you're making will likely influence which process and closure tools you choose to use. So that first one, clear proposal decision statement. Often we make a decision in a meeting without even acknowledging that it was a formal decision. So maybe your team needs someone to table at a local event next weekend. Someone volunteers to take on the task, everyone agrees to the plan, great. No formal vote is taken, but a decision has in fact been made. Alex is going to table at Co-op Connection this weekend. It might, it's hopefully captured in the minutes, but it was probably not, the decision that you felt the need to vote on. So we're making decisions all the time, sometimes without even acknowledging them formally. When the decision is of greater consequence, a governing body will likely make the decision more formal by taking a vote. So there are, different frameworks by which you can take votes. You can use a simple majority or some other agreed upon percentage. If your decision-making rule is unanimity, everyone has to agree in order to move forward with that decision. Boards may have different decision rules based on the decision. And sometimes these decision-making rules are spelled out in a co-op's policies or bylaws, particularly for sort of important decisions related to, kicking out, removing a director or removing a member or things like that. So in addition to there being sort of different thresholds that are required in order for a decision to pass, there might also be different ways of voting that, again, increase participation and make people feel more comfortable with participation, that just shifts the dynamic. So you could all do a simultaneous vote where, all in favor say yay, all opposed say nay, do you abstain? and everyone does it at the same time. You could do a go-around where, you go around the table or the Zoom call and you say, what your vote is, or you could do a blind vote. So just being thoughtful about how you're going about that formal closure tool. I have found that these standard decision-making rules, so the voting, just sort of a proposal, a decision statement, don't always do a good job of reflecting the nuances of how people actually feel. So most of us do not think in black or white, yes or no terms, but when we move immediately from discussing an issue to taking an up-down vote, we really force people to pick a side. And so gradients of agreement is a tool that can help a group navigate that gray area more effectively and hopefully come up with decisions that feel good to more people. So as you're moving closer to closure on a decision, instead of jumping to a vote or even just doing a straw poll that's like up down, the gradients of agreement tool gives you a little bit more nuance in how you approach how people are feeling. So instead of just an up-down poll, you might ask people sort of, on a scale of 1 to 8, on a scale of 1 to 5, how are you feeling about this proposal? It gives us better language to talk about it. And so, maybe you've got, if you were to do an up, no, up, down, yes, no, maybe it doesn't pass because you have 5 no's and 4 yeses. But if you were to use this gradients of agreement tool and you could actually understand that people aren't in veto territory, but they actually voted no because they think, they want more discussion, they need to understand an issue better, they don't like one small piece of the proposal, and so they voted no. Using these gradients of agreement also shifts the nature of the conversation, in that those who are maybe wholehearted endorsers or agree with maybe a minor point of contention can really invite those who are closer, in the 5s and 6s, 4, 5, 6, into a conversation about, how would this proposal need to shift to make you feel comfortable with it? And so it really changes the dynamic of, defending your position, yes, no, against, or for, and saying, trying to understand more deeply why someone might be hesitant to approve a proposal. So I've just found this to be a really good tool, particularly in more nuanced conversations about big decisions that can also then, if you, because you may never know if you just take an up-down vote on a hot issue and it's a, 5-4 split, you may never know actually why someone didn't agree, and people could leave that decision feeling dissatisfied, and it can create sort of a negative dynamic within the group, whereas gradients of agreement just, again, provides better vocabulary and a more nuanced approach to understanding where people stand on an issue. All right, let's move on to meeting roles. So now that we've talked about the importance of agendas and how to structure agendas and some processes for discussion and decision making, I think it's important to talk about meeting roles. So I would argue that a meeting agenda is only as effective as the people leading the group through the agenda, or the person leading the people through the agenda. If meeting agendas are train tracks, the meeting facilitator is kind of like the train conductor. So maybe I have a 3-year-old who really likes trains, so maybe why I'm going to this train analogy, but really the facilitator is key to sort of keeping the group focused and on track. So the meeting facilitator's role is not to just make decisions, it is to facilitate the process of the group making decisions. And a skilled facilitator ensures that all members of the group are engaged and effectively synthesizes the various viewpoints into a coherent direction. When there are disagreements, the facilitator takes the pulse of the room and comes up with strategies for achieving win-win solutions. Most board meetings are chaired by the board president, However, I encourage everyone who sits on a board to go through some kind of facilitation training. I think it's a good leadership opportunity, leadership development opportunity that you can offer board members as a co-op. And quite frankly, we're all better meeting participants when we understand what the facilitator is trying to accomplish, what their job is, and thus what our jobs are as meeting participants. In addition to a facilitator, every board meeting should have a designated recorder or note taker. That's really common. The recorder keeps minutes during the meeting, recording key decisions, conclusions, and action items. The board secretary is often the recorder, though in larger cooperatives, there may be a board assistant who compiles board minutes. Another common meeting role is the timekeeper. The timekeeper essentially helps the facilitator move the group through the agenda by keeping track of time. If the group is close to running out of time for a topic, the timekeeper will alert the facilitator, who can then work with the full group to decide how to proceed. Having a timekeeper isn't necessary, but it is a great way to reduce the amount of stress on the facilitator, who's really managing a lot and managing the discussion. I have found that assigning someone who is already very time-oriented to be the timekeeper can be like doubly helpful. So as my colleagues know all too well, my Swiss-German heritage really comes out in a big way when I am a meeting participant, and I can be really oriented on time. And so when I am the timekeeper in a meeting, being the timekeeper gives me this productive way to channel that energy, which can prevent it from turning into frustration if it feels like no one else is watching the clock. I get to watch the clock. It's my job. So a little silver lining of having someone who is also time-oriented be the timekeeper. The last role I want to mention is the sensor or mood reader role. This is not a very common one, but the objective is to have somebody sense the temperature of the meeting and spot unhelpful moods or group dynamics that might be emerging. For example, resignation. Is someone just going through the motions? If so, sort of what, you might want to explore what the underlying dynamics are that are contributing to that. Skilled facilitators typically do this as part of their role. However, during particularly complex or contentious discussions, it can be helpful to share this responsibility with another meeting participant. All right, next topic. I'd like to spend a little time on committees and how to use them most effectively. So first, it's important to understand which tasks are appropriate for board committees and which are not. Board committees are an extension of the board, a tool for getting certain kinds of work done, often the types of work that are easier with a smaller group. So getting those things done outside the boardroom. So what kinds of activities are best done by committee? Committees are great for organizing events and short-term processes, for detail-oriented planning, for research, writing, editing. Most board committees do not have decision-making authority. So the role of the committee is to carry out a directive of the board or craft a proposal for the whole board to review. Their role is to accomplish things outside the boardroom and bring the results back to the board for review or approval. There are generally two types of committees that boards use: standing committees and ad hoc committees. Standing committees manage board work that is ongoing. Some typical standing committees might include finance, member engagement, policy, GM performance evaluation, audit, board development. Ad hoc committees are established to manage tasks or processes that are time-bound, such as hiring a new general manager or evaluating potential sites for expansion. So committee charters, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation, are an important tool for establishing the roles, responsibilities, and authority of each committee. Think of them as job descriptions for committees. They're useful for setting the appropriate expectations for committee members and for board members who are not on the committee and need to understand what the role of the committee is. They also force a board to be really clear about the purpose and duration of a new committee before formally establishing it, helping to avoid committee overload. It can be easy as a board to just say, oh, well, we'll just create a committee and the committee will manage it. No one wants to be on a board that also requires serving on 5 committees. At least I don't want to be, speaking for myself. Committee charters can also be a useful addition to board orientation packets, I found. So new directors can quickly understand the function of the different committees and which one or ones they might like to join. So before covering the last tool during the presentation today, I'd like to say a few words about culture. I often include the quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast" in my governance presentations because I think it's so true. It's something we don't always talk about, but it's just as important as the rules and systems and policies and processes in terms of how a co-op's governance system functions. So the culture of a group, and every group has a culture, is based on or determined by the group's norms, values, habits, beliefs, language, and sort of assumptions about how people go about doing their work, how people interact with one another, and how people interact with customers and or members. So cultural norms are visible and invisible, and they often need interpretation, especially for people who are new to the group. We may not see the culture of a group we belong to because we've just grown so accustomed to it being the norm. We literally don't see it. If you're new to your role on a board of directors, you're sort of both at an advantage and a disadvantage when it comes to culture. You may not have a firm grasp on the culture, so there's the potential to offend someone or make mistakes. On the flip side, you will still see things that others in the group do not see, and you can provide really useful information as an outsider if they are willing to hear it. So the last tool I want to talk about here, just want to talk about sort of a broad set of tools that I refer to generally as ground rules. All of the items listed on the slide are ways of sort of putting in writing how directors are expected to act. These ground rules might show up in bylaws, policies, job descriptions, or member agreements, or in their own separate documents. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, the culture of any group or organization is both visible and invisible, explicit and implicit. And ground rules in their various forms are mechanisms by which you can document the desired culture of your co-op and board. Instead of assuming that people will just get it when they join the board, ground rules clearly lay out what is expected of directors, sort of what is and is not tolerated. So let's start with group agreements. The purpose of group agreements is to really create an open and respectful environment in which teams can work together creatively and individuals feel safe sharing their ideas and opinions. Group agreements are often set at the beginning of retreats or workshops or strategic planning sessions. However, I see value in establishing and revisiting group agreements for any group that regularly meets and makes decisions together. When I run strategic planning sessions or retreats with co-op boards, we often do group agreements at the beginning, and I encourage them to take those group agreements back to their boardroom and have them on the wall where they meet regularly as a reminder of the agreements that they made and to revisit them. I think it can be a useful tool long past a retreat or strategic planning session. A conflict of interest policy requires board members to disclose outside interests conflicting with the interests of the cooperative. Kelly covered conflict of interest in her session last week. So a conflict of interest policy should require those with a conflict or those who think they may have a conflict to disclose that conflict. That's the key. The policy should also outline how the board will move forward on matters in which there is a conflict. So next, confidentiality. Members of a cooperative board have a fiduciary duty to keep private certain information learned in the course of board service. There are certain things they have a legal obligation to keep confidential. That legal obligation exists even in the absence of an express written confidentiality policy, but I still suggest having one anyway to reiterate the importance of keeping certain business information private. That's one of the tensions in a cooperative business is sort of, transparency, which is really important, but also keeping confidential business information that could be damaging if it were to be made public. So a code of conduct is a document that outlines the rules, responsibilities, practices, and norms of a group or organization. Often a code of conduct will include sections related to confidentiality and conflict of interest. So last on the list is director position descriptions. I sort of mentioned this earlier. These may seem like a bit of an outlier, but I included them in the list because I do think they're a great tool for setting expectations regarding board director responsibilities. I've also seen them used to communicate sort of the norms about active engagement, respectful communication, and some of the other things you might find in group agreements. So you're reinforcing those behaviors in the director board description. So I once belonged to a board that actually asked directors to sign a set of agreements related to their responsibilities, related to confidentiality, conflict of interest, every single year. So when that new board was seated and the new directors came in, they signed it, but we all signed it too, just as a reminder of what we were committing to that year. And I think that's a useful exercise that I encourage boards to consider. So with that, I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. So I think Kelly's going to take a couple questions first, and then I'll be here to answer questions as well.
Yes. We had a few questions come in over the course of the presentation. Thank you, Courtney. So the first one that came in, we have a policy that all producer members participate in at least one committee of the board. What do other co-ops do if members just don't contribute in this way? Yeah, that's hard. I think there's thinking about, there's a couple things I'd offer here. If there's any way to have a one-on-one conversation with that member about why they aren't participating in the committee, in a committee, I think in a way that's not necessarily putting them on the spot, but giving them the chance to give an honest answer. There might be something going on with them that you just don't know about. I recommend, this might already be in place, but if you have some sort of annual membership agreement that people kind of revisit every year, making sure that this committee participation is kind of front and center there, and reminding people that they get access to their full set of member rights by fulfilling the full set of member responsibilities. When working with a co-op where this very minimal participation from one member had been an issue, and there was a designated board person who had a conversation with them. You want to balance some understanding and providing a motivational strategy with there being kind of repercussions for not participating. If there aren't committee charters, maybe they don't participate in a committee because it's not clear where they might fit, or what the purposes of the committees are. So really thinking through making sure there is clarity about with committee charters, some other mechanism. Yeah. Anything you'd add on that, Courtney?
Yeah, I think I think that people don't participate for different reasons, and so trying to really understand what that underlying reason is. Is it because they are managing a lot of other things and this just cannot, they literally can't participate? Is it because they don't think the meetings are worth their time? Is it, I think so trying to really understand what that underlying reason is. And then I would just add, and Kelly's answer, I think, alluded to this, is that it's not the board president's job to make sure that people on the board are participating. It's everyone's job. And so I've, seen dynamics too where it's well, the board president should just talk to them. And, maybe that is the right solution, but taking some ownership as a group for mutual accountability, I think, is a good tact as well. So I think, there was a question that came in through registration about are there tools for basically holding members to their time commitments, that one is hard, you know, especially if it's a volunteer board. People aren't getting compensated, but even when they are, I mean, it's that is a perennial issue for any, you know, groups that are trying to keep people engaged and participating. And I, you know, like Kelly said, you know, are there policies that in place for if people don't participate that there are sort of repercussions? But it's accountability on boards is a really tricky issue. I've one of the tools that I've tried to use is doing board self-evaluations, and at least trying to understand why, you know, how people view their own participation, how they view the effectiveness of the board, and trying to tease things out from those type of evaluations to help improve participation. But again, it's a tough one.
So a question came in from the chat about committee charters, and are committee charters outlined by the board before the committee starts out, or can the charter be created by the committee and brought to the board for approval? What I've often recommended to groups is it can be a little bit of a combination of both things. The board, you know, the full board meeting may have a lot on its plate, so they can say we need, you know, a marketing committee. You know, they could roughly, you know, we need, you know, at a minimum, we need the marketing committee to be focused on these 3 topics or accomplish these few things. The committee can draft a charter and bring it back to the board for that final approval. So there's a little bit of, the board has given some guidance and ultimately has the final say, and maybe they add things to the draft charter. But there's the committee charter itself can be part of the work of the committee starting out. And I think that gives the people then who decide to form that committee more ownership over what they are endeavoring to do with the board. Mm-hmm. We had another question that came in during the presentation about where does a strategic plan fit within the core documents. You know, I'd say that it kind of fits within a bunch of things. You may have policies about related to how and when you do strategic plans, or you know what needs to be included in a strategic plan. You may have policies related to your manager or management about their their evaluation being tied to things in a strategic plan, or you know, meeting goals that are set out in that plan. So it is another guiding document. And you know, depending on the size of your co-op, the strategic plan, it might be something. Ideally, there's been some mechanism for all members to weigh in. You know, in really large co-ops, they might not have been engaged. Not the whole membership might not have been engaged in the whole process, but you do want it to be reflective of the whole membership. So it's not necessarily just a board document. But anything you'd want to add, Courtney, about strategic plan and core documents?
No, I have a couple of questions that came in from registration that I just want to touch on. One is, what are some small steps the board can take to address a poor meeting culture? Hopefully, we spent a lot of time talking about meetings. Hopefully what I talked about gave you some ideas. I find that the best meetings, the meetings that keep people coming back, strike a really good balance between being fun and productive. So, and fun doesn't mean like, oh, we're having a party. You know, they're you know, provide a mechanism for meaningful connection with other humans, but you're also getting stuff done. And so if you don't hit both of those notes, I think you can lose people, sometimes for different reasons. But I think those are two things to strive for. Another question that came in was, you know, what are some of the ways that co-ops ensure a plethora of opportunities for aspiring leaders besides just running for the board of directors? Committees can be an awesome place to plug people in, whether you're you know, in startup phase or a longstanding co-op. Committees, if you're a fairly large co-op, I've seen sort of delegate structures where you might not actually be on the executive board, but you're a delegate from your region. I've seen sort of appointed positions on boards used in interesting ways. I've seen like a specific position for a, a young leader that participates. They may not be a voting member of the board, but they participate. So there are a lot of creative structures you can use to channel people before they might be ready to run for the board. There was one other question about, so how do you get everyone on the same team? How do you inspire the board to further inspire membership? It's a great question. There were a couple of questions that I sort of lumped together. I think one is sort of using your mission, vision, like why, raison d'etre, as a touch point for your group and returning to it often. Even I found something as simple as starting a meeting on occasion, not all the time, maybe it's a retreat with, why did you decide to run for this board? Helping people reconnect with what motivated them to even, endeavor to be on the board can be a simple but really powerful exercise for everyone to hear, but also for themselves to reconnect with that inspiration for joining the board. You may get an answer like, oh, I felt like I had to, like sometimes you do get these like one-off sort of maybe less inspiring ones, but I found it to be a useful exercise. So again, finding those touch points as a group and as individuals, writing things down in terms of getting people on the same team. When you're running a business as a cooperative, making sure that people have access to the same information, it's written down. And then lastly, I would just say finding ways to build social connections between board members. Being on a board can be hard. It can be stressful. Often, before COVID, we were like sitting in boardrooms, at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday after, maybe working all day. And so I find that making time and space to build meaningful social connections with your fellow board members can sustain you through those stressful, more difficult times. And without those, that conflict, there were some questions that came about conflict too. That conflict can really win the day unless you have a solid foundation. I know it's harder than ever right now to find ways to build those meaningful social connections, but I think it's more important than ever, honestly, given what we're going through right now. So I will stop. Are there other questions, Kelly, that came in?
No.
Okay. Let's see if I have any here. Well, it's 10:28. So, well, thanks so much for all the questions that you submitted via registration and through the Q&A box. We will wrap things up here. So I just want to remind you of the bevy of co-op development and co-op specialists that we have at the Center for Cooperatives. So if you have follow-up questions, want to talk to someone at the center, please don't hesitate to reach out to one of us. We all have sort of slightly different sets of expertise and would be happy to have a conversation with you. And with that, I will turn things back over to Kelly to close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you to everyone for joining. A couple of reminders. We will be back next Wednesday, May 20th, from 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. Central Time with the third and final in this webinar series about Cooperative Finance 101. We hope you can join us for that and send the news along to folks you know. Within the day or by tomorrow, you should receive a couple of emails. There were some folks last time who I think maybe had them go to their spam folder. You will have a link to an evaluation for today. Please do fill it out. We absolutely take your comments and questions to heart. An email will also include a link to the recording for today. So if you want to watch parts again, or you would like other folks on your board, for example, to watch it, they can watch the entire thing, and there will be a PDF of the presentation. So keep an eye out for those emails. Please fill out the evaluation and register for next week if you haven't already, and we'll see you next Wednesday at 9:30 a.m.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.